Let me just first of all just introduce what I'm going to talk about today. This is the last of this series of talks. I'm going to talk about Tory England a little bit. So I thought what I would do is do a little review of what we've been talking about before, briefly, or maybe not that briefly, I don't know. And then go back to the 2019 general election and see what we can learn from that. Because that, in some ways is the last big mass event, when millions of people came out and did something, voting in elections. So it'd be worthwhile looking to see what we can see from that. Then I want to talk about the idea of the Tory state rather than the Tory party or even the Tory government. And then talk about the English question and what I think that's about. And then just see if we could reconsider the election and then end up back with the Labour Party again, where we all began in the first place. So that's really kind of what I want to do. And so my first point is to just do a little review of this idea we've just been talking about now, just to sort of re-engage on that. So this, and the last point that was being made is very important, I think. The idea that if the system is not just in decline, with Thatcher dismantled and Blair dismantled the social monarchy, but that was one thing. But since the financial crisis, we've gone into a much worse condition of degeneration. That's what I've argued. We've entered a period, an epoch, a space of degeneration when things are not working. We've got a crisis of democracy. And I suppose we could say that a crisis of democracy means that the democracy is in transition. It's going somewhere. We may not know where it's going at the moment, but it's going somewhere other than it's about to go somewhere else. Now, I made the point that one direction was towards fascism or towards a kind of authoritarianism, not even that fascism. We can't see any mass fascist party at the moment. That doesn't appear to be the case. But the point that Larry was making previously, I think, is very important. If people become cynical and fed up and think this democracy isn't working, people will say, no, our democracy's failed, it's not working. Somebody will say, well, let's do away with all that. Let's just get some strong person in who could sort it all out and make the trains run on time. That was Mussolini and all the rest of it. So it isn't the case that if there's a crisis of democracy, people necessarily draw democratic ideas from it. They could easily go towards that. Let's get rid of all this corruption by having a dictator of some kind. As I say, we don't see that yet. And I think the other side of it is we should and could be going towards republicanism. That's the democratic answer to the crisis of democracy, is to do that. So, and down the bottom, the little red bit there is Republican socialism. So I see socialism as growing out of that, coming from that side of the equation. That's that side of the problem. Anyway, degeneration, meaning retardation, going backwards, putrefaction, I think Marie came up with that one, and she also came up with the process of decomposition in one of her emails. So that was excellent. I thought I'll steal those ideas and incorporate them in there. Corruption is very important in all this. Social murder, we talked about what happened at Grenfell Tower and what's happening in COVID and lots of other things. Growing racism, growing sexism. These things are all a sign of a society that's decomposing in some senses, is putrefying in some ways, which means that our Republican politics, it's more urgent that Republicanism is seen as an alternative to all this, and it isn't yet seen as that. We're just on the fringe of where that is. So it's a system crisis. Now, I thought I would take a couple of examples just to illustrate this before going on. I thought I would take the idea of try to just use the idea of racism, and I realised that this might be misunderstood, so I need to be very careful with this. But if we took this idea of degeneration and racism, we might say, and people do think, that maybe the racism we have in our society is a legacy of empire, that although it's continuing, perhaps it seems to be a bit in decline. Perhaps we've become more multiracial with the passage of time. If we take football in the 1980s and football in 2020, we can see a much more multiracial football game. It seems to be things have got better. A lot of people think, well, things have got a bit better. There may be lots of things wrong with it. There's lots of racism around. We just had the Yorkshire cricket issue case as well. But degeneration means a kind of political racism which means that things are getting worse. So in a period of degeneration, even if the long-term decline of racism has been down a bit, in a period of degeneration, we'd expect racism to get worse. We'd see things to get better. You can see and I will now turn to the anti-Semitism row in the Labour Party and give a slightly different take on it. But in the case of Tsarism, the Tsarist regime deliberately promoted anti-Semitism. They promoted pogroms because their system was degenerated. The Tsarist regime was corrupt and rotten to the core. And the way they kept in power was to fan the flames of anti-Semitism and promote pogroms. So you can see in a state of degeneration, an unstable regime will turn to racism as a solution, actually promote it. So we can have a discussion about whether racism is getting worse or better, and that's something we can think about. In the Labour Party, if we go to the example of the Labour Party, anti-Semitism exists in the Labour Party, but is insignificant. That was the point that Tony Greenstein made. It was fairly marginal. There would be people who had anti-Semitic views, but it was relatively marginal. But in an epoch of a degenerate social monarchy, what might happen? We might all of a sudden find that anti-Semitism suddenly appears. So if you think of the rise of Corbyn, you could say that the rise of Corbyn was a response to the degeneration of the state. You know, people turn to somebody completely outside the mainstream, Corbyn, a fringe politician. Suddenly he becomes the leader of the Labour Party unexpectedly, because the system has got into such a state of decline with austerity and all the rest of it. And then anti-Semitism is actually weaponized deliberately and used. Now, if that's, you could say that's completely a sign of degeneration, because politics is being used deliberately. And even if you might say we had an honest press, they would have soon worked out that this anti-Semitism farrago was a lot of nonsense if anybody was being honest. But the press weren't even being honest. Nobody was being honest because they were using it for those aims. So I think the anti-Semitism row in the Labour Party clearly was designed to get rid of Corbyn, undermine Corbyn. But I think it's a sign of a society which is degenerating and using racism as a political tool, a political weapon in a situation where things are going into. Oh, somebody just come up and done that. Okay, sorry about that. What's happened there? What can you now see? Because something's. We've
got the face page.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, it went back. So I got there. Sorry about that. I had the Adobe thing came on and started playing up. Anyway. Okay, so that was one aspect to it. So just playing through on the question of racism. Is racism going out? Is it going to? I think we're in a period where racism will be promoted. I do feel it will be on the rise and is on the rise because of the nature of the state we're in. Then the Owen Patterson scandal we've already been talking about. So obviously we've had Patterson lobbying the ministers of the Crown and civil servants. There were two companies, you recall, in that Randox, which were clinical diagnostics. And that's something does go back to COVID in some ways. I think there's a lot of money being punted their way, by the way. And then there's another company, had Lynn's Country Foods, meat products, £100,000 for consulting, right? Now, his defense, by the way, and it's interesting, he said he had no right of appeal. It was not natural justice. I mean, he was caught red-handed. He was banged to rights on every single way you could see that, you know, completely in violation of the rules. But I just thought of this slightly other angle on it. Was he said he had no right to appeal, but he did appeal to the select committee and they turned it down. He was about to appeal to the House of Commons. So that was another appeal. That was like second stage of appeal, although it got derailed. But where did he really appeal to? Well, he appealed to the Crown. In what guise? He appealed to the Crown in the guise of Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson, then who through using the Crown's control of Parliament and through the whipping system, was then able to overthrow the whole thing. So they involved themselves in the corruption by doing that. But as Republicans, if we're thinking of it from a Republican perspective, we would always say to Owen Patterson, well, why don't you just resign and go to the electorate in Shrewsbury and see what they think about all this? See if they want to see if they want to put your appeal to the people, because if we believe in the sovereignty of the people, they're going to be the judge and jury over this. Of course, he didn't do that. He resigned first rather than do that. Or in a Republican system, you'd have a right of recall. So the electors of North Staffordshire, I think it was North Shropshire, they could have just called him back and said, right, mate, here you go. So in a Republican system, everything would go back to the people. That would be the final court of appeal. But he goes to the Crown, so he goes to Boris Johnson and gets Boris Johnson to fix it. And of course, John Major, who came in, I'll just finish on this one. John Major made his speech, and he said that the Johnson administration, I mean, it's quite condemning, was politically corrupt. I mean, we have not heard that sort of language. It was a politically corrupt treatment of the House of Commons. And he said this action was immensely damaging. It was very embarrassing, and it hurt Parliament. I think it brings Parliament into disrepute. It brings Parliament into disrepute, and is therefore part of this crisis of democracy, because it brings the very cynicism that Larry mentioned before. You know, people will see this; they think we can't do anything about it. They're all politicians are corrupt. The whole system's corrupt. We might as well, I don't know, have an authoritarian dictator to sort it all out. So it always raises a question, can the House of Commons or the people have any control over this? And obviously the House of Commons didn't, and the people couldn't, but the Tory press forced a retreat, you know, because they thought it was gone a bit too far. And angry people lobbying their Tory MPs appear to have also shaken them all up quite a bit as well. So I see this as a classic, because it isn't just about one person, it's about the whole system being seen as corrupt and failing, as comrades have already said. Okay, so I think what all I want to say from this point is we need to look out for all of these daily examples of degeneration, of which I believe they'll be coming at us thick and fast, in my opinion, and the system will seem to be in crisis. Okay, so let me move on then to the first point in my talk, which really was this one. I thought I would start with the 2019 general election. Would be a good place to start, and just see if I could look at some of the numbers, because and again, I will always cite this election. It's not a normal election in the normal last 50 years of elections. We're into a rather strange period of degeneration and crisis of democracy. So what do we get in the election? So I've sort of tried to summarize it like this. It's like it becomes four nations voting. We start to see these four nations. Let's see what happens. Well, in Northern Ireland, there's a sort of draw. You've got the DUP got 8 seats, parliamentary seats. Sinn Féin got 7 seats. And you can see the nature of politics in Northern Ireland is basically unionism versus nationalism and republicanism. That's how it's panned out. It's been like that for ages anyway. It's nothing new there. We're talking, you know, 50 years, 100 years, whatever. There's been that struggle between unionism and nationalism and republicanism. And nationalism and republicanism go together in Northern Ireland, as in the form of Sinn Féin. When you look over to Scotland, there's something else happening. Because in Scotland, the SNP got 48 out of 59 seats. And again, it's the same thing. In Scotland, the battle is between unionism on one hand and nationalism on the other. You don't see a lot of republicanism in Scotland, but again, republicanism is on the left of nationalism. You will see bits of republicanism coming to the left, you know, because the SNP is not a Republican party. It's not wanting to make Scotland a republic. It wants to make Scotland an independent Scotland, to be a constitutional monarchy, or at least have the Queen in some way, you know, perhaps like Canada or Australia or something. It's arm's length type monarch. But you'll find on the left of the SNP republicanism. So nationalism and republicanism are going together. In Wales, Labour win 22 seats out of 40. Plaid Cymru are still not growing particularly, so unionism there includes the Labour Party. Nationalism and republicanism are all around Plaid Cymru. But there is something happening in Wales, by the way. I do believe that there's a Yes Cymru movement. There is a growth. They're looking to Scotland, to the RIC movement in Scotland. And I think during the pandemic, where Wales established its own independent kind of presence through Mark Drayford speaking out and taking an independent line. So there's a different election going on there. So you've got in Scotland, the National Party of Scotland is the SNP. The National Party of Wales is Labour. And in England, the Tories had got 345 seats compared to Labour's 100 Labour's 180 seats. Now I'm going to talk about English nationalism and English republicanism at some point in all of that. But that is a stunning victory. For England, the Tories are the National Party of England. That's the conclusion we must come to in all of that. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. So we've got really four different places. Wales is a bit more like England, it's in between, but Northern Ireland and Scotland are going in parallel. And that was the same when we come to Brexit, when both Northern Ireland and Scotland voted to remain in the EU and England and Wales voted to leave the EU. And that in itself added to this whole thing. Now, it's interesting, if you go back, and I'm talking about this, if you go back to the year 2010 and look at the general election in 2010, Labour got 41 seats in Scotland and the SNP had 6 seats. So at the very beginning of this epoch of what I've called degeneration, the SNP was only still the minor party in terms of winning seats. Labour was the main party in Scotland and had been for quite a long time, even back to since the 50s. But since 2010, the SNP have absolutely romped it on every single election since, and Labour's virtually gone into a serious decline. So there has been a shift since 2010 in Scotland, and Scotland has gone off on a different route altogether. So we can see that I'm only now going to talk about England. I'm going to concentrate on England, but all of these four parts of the system are moving in different directions. So, and I'll just make this point, I've kind of already made it. In Northern Ireland and Scotland, politics revolves around the axis of unionism versus nationalism and republicanism. Scotland is now more in line with Northern Ireland, really, in that regard. And that's true, as I say, in how they approach the European Union. Wales remains Labour, but because I do see signs of a growing movement in Wales, but England is very Tory. If you look at the votes for England, in 2010, the Tories got 9.9 million votes. They got 10.4 million votes in 2015, 12.3 million votes in 2017, and in 2019, 12.7 million votes. Their vote has been going up on every single occasion. And given what's happened to the country in this period of degeneration, the terrible social crisis and the poverty that they have created, you've got to think this is just counterintuitive. You think, surely that can't be what's happened. Surely how can we explain that, really? How can we explain what the Tories are doing? And in fact, it doesn't really start with this period, because the Tories, since 1945, the Tories have been in government 75% of the time. That's 57 out of 76 years in England. And the question is, well, how can you really explain all that then? How can we explain the hegemony of the Tory party, the domination of the Tory party in English politics? Because don't forget, if England is by largest population, the party that wins England ultimately controls the whole of the union, controls everywhere, ultimately, because that's just the fact of how it is. So the question might be, why did the Tories win in 2019? And I think I'm going to put up two things for people to think about. One is, I'm going to say this, I think that the Conservative and Unionist Party, to give them their official title, I might just see if I can put that aside a bit. Yeah, that gets rid because I can see my writing. Is the dominant party in England under the Tory state and have built-in advantages. So the Tories are likely to win because they've got all sorts of advantages, and we should think, why have they got those built-in advantages? And I'll say something about that. So that's one thing. So the Tories are more likely to win any election going because they always manage to do that and have been doing that for a hell of a long time. But in this epoch of degeneration, what's happened is that the Johnson Tories have adapted and encouraged the rise of English nationalism. So I think there's something else happening in this period of degeneration, and that is the rise of English nationalism. And the big trigger for the rise of English nationalism was, of course, the whole Brexit debate, because we'll come around to say something about that a bit more in a minute. But Brexit is one of the keys to turn to as it were, to weaponize, if you like, an English nationalism. So we have to, in England, on the left in England, have to address this question of what the state of play is in England. And unfortunately, the left in England doesn't tend to do that too well, often, if at all. But anyway, so in my opinion, now there's lots of things going on in the Labour Party. I'm not ignoring the Labour Party in what I'm saying. I'm just highlighting a couple of points that I think we need to take into account. You know, a divided Labour Party is never going to win. And, you know, we now divided the Labour Party was with all the infighting and how divided it was over Brexit. But I'm just talking about the advantages that the Tories had in doing this. And so I think we ought to think of it in terms of a little bit like this, of the idea of a Tory state. We could call it the constitutional monarchy. We could also call it the Tory state, I think. Conservative and Labour are loyalist parties. And if we just use that term, think about this as a Tory state. Well, I was thinking about this historically. If we look back into our history, look back into our history, it seems to be, and I've just been kind of looking at this recently, our constitutional monarchy and union state, which is still the foundation of our present constitution, goes back to the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 1707. Started in 1688, and it goes to 1707 with the Act of Union with Scotland. The party that made this kind of revolution, so-called revolution, because it wasn't really a revolution, it was in some ways, was the Whigs. So there were two parties of that period, the Whig Party and the Tory Party. The Whig Party was the heirs of the Parliamentary Party, and the Tories were the heirs of the Cavaliers and the Royalist Party from the Civil War previously. So you could say we had a Whig state formed by the Whigs when they invited, with the City of London, when they invited William of Orange to come over, which is why my colour's orange up there, by the way. However, you might argue, and I think I would argue, that around about the 1870s, there was a sort of rejigging of the whole thing. And at that time, one of the key people in that was Disraeli. He came up with the idea, he's attributed to One Nation Tories, but the Tories brought in the 1867 Reform Act to give a section of the working class the right to vote. And Disraeli also made Queen Victoria the Empress of India. So they created an imperial, they incorporated the working class. They gave the working class something quite radical, I suppose, for the Tories to do, but they gave the votes to a certain section of the working class. They were still property owners. And they emphasized the idea of the one nation, which we still hear in Tory politics. So they really took over from that period onwards. And the great Liberal Party was to split over Ireland. And I think ever since that time, you can trace through that most of the time since the Tories rejigged the state, and the state became something different. From 1867, 1884, 1918, women got some votes, 1928. So in that whole period from 1867 to 1928, we got to universal suffrage. So the original constitutional monarchy of 1688 had now become the same thing, but with people having the right to vote to Parliament. And so the fundamentals of the Tory party have always been the Tories' fundamentals, where the support for the monarchy and the House of Lords, the Church of England, the Union, the Westminster Parliament, the public schools, Oxbridge, the two-party system, the Tory press, and all these other things. And I think these are the fundamentals of the Tory state. It's like the Communist Party of the Soviet Union created the Soviet state, and they were always the dominant party ever after. And the Tory party has been the dominant party in our state because they've created a system of which they are the inheritors of, or the maintainers of. And so if you were going to compare, therefore, we say the Tories are not just conservatives like the US Republicans, the Christian Democrats, and I don't know who they've got in France these days, Marie, maybe it's the French Gaullists still exist, I don't know, but anyway. But the Tory party is really the party of the Anglo-British state. Its fundamental principles are monarchy, Church of England, and union. And I saw some interesting figures that said the Tories were called Anglicans. Those areas of this country where people were tied to the Anglican Church voted Tory in 1850. It's almost the same areas of voting Tory in 1850 than are today. And the non-conformist people, like in Wales, the Methodists, or the Catholics in Scotland, those areas are deeply, there's a sort of inbuilt religious divide somewhere in our politics. But the Tories have been always the party. I've always said the Tories were the Church of England at prayer. Or the Church of England was the Tories at prayer, was probably the right way round to say that. So when Labour opposes the Tory party, it supports really the Tory state. So the Tory party is, so, you know, when there's a sense in which Tony Blair's got it right. We call him Tory Blair, but what Tory Blair was saying is if you really want to run this country, you've got to be quite Tory-like, because you'll never get anywhere in this country if you don't be a bit like the Tories. And there's a certain truth to what Blair was saying with that, you know. So we as Republicans, obviously, we're going to oppose the Tory state and not just the Tory party or the Tory government. And that's what we argue. It's not good enough just to stand against the Tory party in elections if the state is biased completely towards the Tories and all the institutions favour them. And that is, so our republicanism is not about the Labour Party particularly, it's actually about the Tory state and the Tory system and why that system it doesn't work. Okay, so that's the first reason, the inbuilt bias towards the Tory party that's built into our culture, ideas, values, attitudes, imperialist attitudes, monarchist attitudes, all those things that we could talk about in culture. So I then wanted to consider, which is my next point, which is what I'll call it the English question. Now, what do we mean by the term the English question? Okay, well, you've heard the term the national question, the Irish, you often hear the Catalan question, you often hear these questions. What does it really mean? Well, it means that it's a political question about who and how England should be governed. You know, the Irish question is about who should govern Ireland and how should they do it. The Catalan question, who should govern Catalonia these days? Who should govern Spain? So the English question is always about who should govern England. Now, in this country, we think the English question was settled a long time ago. We did try to settle it in 1649. Then we settled it in 1688. So sort of 300 years it got settled. We didn't bother about it anymore. Then it got changed again a bit between 1867 and 1928 with the arrival of universal suffrage. And then you could say it was kind of settled in 1945 when we got a new social contract. The social monarchy. So in a certain sense, there wasn't an English question because people simply accepted that England was governed the way it was governed and it was sort of working okay and all those sorts of things. Now, as socialists, we say, well, we bring another angle to that. So we say, well, for us, it means, well, it's a class question. Which class is governing the country and how are they doing it? That's what the English question is for us. Which class is governing England and how are they doing it? And so we're interested in the English question, but we're giving it a different angle, on it. You know, we're coming at it from a slightly different angle, but we're raising the same question. Who's governing England, how they're doing it? So the argument is that In 2008, with the financial crash, with degeneration, with the crisis of democracy, there has arisen a new English question. The question of how England's governed is coming back onto the agenda when it's maybe not been on the agenda. Brexit, again, I'll come back to Brexit. Brexit is a big example of that. What was that all about, really? Well, it was about all sorts of different things, but one of the things it was, take back control was the slogan. You know, we need to get back control of the country. It's not, we're not being governed properly because we've been taken over by Brussels and all those sorts of arguments. If we could leave the European Union, we could take back control and then we could get our government back. And that's, of course, what Farage and Johnson were appealing to lots of people who are thinking, this system isn't working for us. We're living in poverty. The situation is not working at all. Everything's gone. And now somebody said, England can get its government back again that we've lost. And they managed to build a mass movement by kind of weaponizing that idea of England. Okay. The English question then, I think, is related to my next point. Okay. What do we mean that? So we could talk about England's democratic deficit. So we could say that in England there is a democratic deficit. Now, we've talked about the UK having a democratic deficit as well before, you know, that we've got a lack of democracy. I saw one example recently, you may have picked, I just was listening to the news the other day. Hormone replacement therapy, HRT. It was you had to pay for it in England, but in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, it's free. Now, the Tories made a big song and dance about this because they made some changes. They didn't make it free in England, by the way, but what they did was they said you can pay for it in over a longer period of time. I don't know the exact details of that. But the question you have to ask is, why was it free in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales and not free in England? Why is that? What's the explanation for that? And there is a kind of explanation for it, which is obviously that the parliaments in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales have been doing something different. And the people of Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales had some more influence over what's going on in their bit of the UK. And the people of England don't seem to have any particular way of doing that. So that's why. But you can look to a whole number of things. You could take social care, which is some kinds of social care are free in Scotland, but they're not free in England. And I could find, I don't have time to find, but we keep a lookout for this because the devolution settlement that we had back in 1997, 1998 has enabled more influence of people in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland than actually happens in England. England, with 56 million people and 80% of the population, is by far the largest, and it's also got the largest and most productive, probably the largest, most productive working class, maybe in Europe, or one of the largest anyway, in Europe. Okay. And yet, John Denham, he was quite a right-wing Labour MP at one time. He left the Labour Party and he's done this set up a whole thing for studying the English question. So he's quite an interesting thing to look at. He says that England is the most centralised nation in Europe without an English government. Right, there's no parliament actually to deal with England, and there's no government in England. There's no publicly accountable English government. And he says there's no real devolution in England because there's absolutely nothing to be devolved. He goes into why that's the case. You can't devolve anything because there's nothing to be devolved in the way it works. So the democratic deficit in the UK is worse or deepest in England. All right, and people in England haven't, despite having the largest working class, we haven't been mobilized to do very much about it. The fact that PR is becoming popular, it's been becoming popular, I think, was it Unite actually passed a resolution at its conference, I think, recently in favor of PR. But that's a sign, you see, that people are dissatisfied and feeling that in England, we don't, everywhere else has a bit of PR anyway, in Scotland, Wales, and in Northern Ireland, but we don't have any of that really in England. So there is in England, there is an English question. It's about how England's governed, and there's a democratic deficit. And, which is my next point, keep an eye on the time here. which is this. Okay, so what we've also seen is the rise of English nationalism. There's a growing awareness of English identity. And part of that is a reaction to Irish, Scottish and Welsh nationalism. There's a sort of resentment going on. How come they getting all these privileges apparently and all those sorts of things? That's been obviously whipped up. And then there's Brexit, which is very much about freeing England from Brussels. So English nationalism is not like it's not like Kurdish nationalism, which is revolt, you know, is in rebellion against the Turks or something like that. It's not growing out of actually real oppression in one sense. It's actually a reactive to, it's growing out of the sense of English identity, because we're not Scottish and we're not Irish and we're not Welsh, and those nations have got more clearer identities. And Farage and co, being an English nationalist, freeing England from Brussels, they managed to whip it up around Brexit. Now, John Denham gave this talk at the Labour Party conference, and he said something which I think is very interesting, which was this. He says that, let's see if we can put that down. He said, there's a shift in national identities between those in England who see themselves as English first and those who see themselves first as British. So I don't know whether, I'd certainly call myself English, but you might call yourself British. Of course, as socialists, we sometimes say that we are citizens of the world, we are internationalists, we don't really have a national identity in that way, and so on and so forth. But here we are in England. But Denham says that those identifying themselves as English, 70% of them voted Tory, and only 20% of them voted Labour. But then he says that Labour won a majority among those who see themselves as British. But he says this is a shrinking minority of the population. So Labour's winning all the Brits in England to support them, but it's a declining number of people. Whereas the Tories are managing to make this pitch for English nationalism, and they're gathering up loads of votes. And Brexit was one of the ways in which they did that. So that means the Labour Party has got a problem. And I was thinking to myself, well, there's a Welsh Labour Party, there's a Scottish Labour Party, and then there's a British Labour Party, as Denham points out. There isn't an English Labour Party. There's only a British one. And Denham goes on to say how the Labour Party is completely confused about England and British, and whether they speak in British terms and not in English terms, and so on and so forth. And there's a complete confusion. And that's something the Labour Party is trying to get to grips with at this point in time. Okay. There's lots of articles, lots of readings about the rise of English nationalism and the consequence of that, and how Boris Johnson has changed the Tory party almost into the English Nationalist Party. But English nationalism, as I said before, is a strange beast, because it's not about England, it's British. It's kind of an Anglo-British nationalism, because obviously the English want to keep, these English nationalists want to keep control of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. You can take that as given, you know, and they also want an empire as well to go with it. So all of that's true. So I then thought about doing a sort of, well, I've called this, I'm going to call this the 2019 election in England reconsidered. So I thought I would do a little bit of a map to, it's almost like a thought experiment. See how we could reconsider this election in England. So we might see what's happening is something like this, although it's yet to be proven. So I'm starting here with England's degeneration at the very top, and I'll work way down. So here we've got the social monarchy. You can take it back from 1945, even during the Second World War. And we're in pairs of people at the top. You've got Churchill and Attlee. They were the Tory and Labour politicians of the 1940s and 50s. Then you've got Macmillan and possibly Wilson into the 60s. And then I put Heath and Callaghan. Also Wilson came in as well. It's not all the prime ministers, by the way. It's just a sort of smattering of them. So in a way, the social monarchy was accepted by the Tories, and it was accepted by the Labour Party as an idea. back in the 50s and 60s, right up into the 70s. And in 1973, the UK joins the common market. And there's a referendum, I think it's 75, it might have been 76, I'm not totally sure. Didn't check it out. Then in the 1980s, you've got the destruction of the social monarchy coming in with Thatcher and Blair. Thatcher carried on by Blair, right up to 2019 when the UK leaves the European Union, which is also part of this degeneration point that I've talked about. Now, if we were to wind the clock back to the 1990s for a minute and think about who was the real leader of English nationalism in the 1990s and who was the leader of English republicanism in our sense, well, in this perspective, the English nationalist was Enoch Powell. Enoch Powell had all the characteristics of English nationalism. He was a monarchist, he was a unionist, he was an imperialist, he was a racist, okay, and a very English politician. So English nationalism was probably in the 1990s would be represented by Enoch Powell, perhaps. And then we could have put English republicanism be represented by Tony Benn, another outrider. They're outside these dotted lines, they're outside of the mainstream. Benn and Powell, both of them are kind of renegades on the fringes of either side, fringe on the right, fringe on the left. But then you could say, well, you know, when you think about it, what Enoch Powell was advocating really is what Boris Johnson's doing. Boris Johnson's become, so this extreme fringe person, Enoch Powell, actually ends up being the prime minister in the shape of Boris Johnson. You know, I'm not saying they're exactly the same characters in any way, shape or form. And yet their policies are very similar. Anti-European, anti-EU, monarchist, nationalistic, imperialistic, racist, etc. All of those things. So in a way, what's happened to the Tory party is it's almost as if Enoch Powell's taken them over and and he's become government. Now, it's a bit more tenuous on the other side, but you could almost say that, well, the heir of Tony Benn, he's become the leader of the Labour Party, sort of bizarrely, you know. So Corbyn now has become the voice of English republicanism because he's got his republicanism from Tony Benn. So this is sort of bizarre. It shows how far things have gone, that now what's fringe politics of the 1990s has gone mainstream by the year 2018-19. And in Johnson and Corbyn, we've got a contest between English nationalism and English republicanism. Now, there's something wrong with that thesis. I'll say in a minute, something doesn't quite slightly go right. But there's something which is slightly true and something which isn't. So in the combat, in the battle between English nationalism and English republicanism, who was going to win that one? Well, we know what did win it. Boris Johnson walked it, and Jeremy Corbyn didn't do very well as an English Republican. So you could think, okay, so you could think that in England the battle going on here was between English nationalism and English republicanism. In the general election, it was the English Tories versus English Labour. And behind these labels, Tory and Labour, English nationalism was dealing with English republicanism, and Johnson was taking on Corbyn. So you'll say to me, well, was Corbyn really a Republican, is what you're going to come. I mean, that's where the whole thing falls down a little bit in this argument. What kind of Republican was Jeremy Corbyn? But anyway, what I'm really saying was the 2019 was not a normal election, but the first of a new type in the epoch of degeneration. We're in transition to a new kind of situation, which we haven't yet seen as it is. We've seen the emergence of a kind of English nationalist. I mean, Boris Johnson's almost putting, with his levelling up agenda, get Brexit done. He's almost doing a one nation social monarchy program. He's reviving the social monarchy, which he can't do, by the way. He'll fail. I mean, that's what this theory says. He's going to fail at that. He can't revive it because it's beyond repair. Okay. So 2019 was not a normal election, and when we see all the sort of slightly strange things that don't fit, we know that we're in transition to we're in the middle of, we're the beginning of some other road to somewhere else. So what have we got here? Let me just have a little look and see. I think it's coming up. I'm going to go back to this. So if we were doing a Republican critique of that, we say, well, Corbyn wasn't a very good Republican, was he? That's the problem. He didn't come forward. It's not Corbyn, by the way. It's the Labour Party. You know, we're talking about the Labour Party didn't come forward and offer the English people at that election a new democracy. They didn't do anything about the democratic deficit. They didn't offer any of these reforms that are needed. We're not in the Corbyn programme. So what kind of republicanism did he offer? And it's a shame that he did, because he lost anyway. He might as well have gone down telling the people of England that they needed a republic and they needed democracy, and then lost. As opposed to he's going down, he went down, got sunk with a program that's not going to have a future, I'm afraid to say, because it doesn't match the objective situation that he's in. So he hasn't left that legacy in that sense, unfortunately. You know, you can fight an election and lose, but you can leave a marker down that means history will come back and vindicate you. But I don't think reviving the social monarchy just is not going to do that. So let me come towards the end now, comrades. Well, so that's just repeating what I've said. You know, English nationalism is really Anglo-British nationalism, bringing up Powell to Boris Johnson. I will send the PowerPoints out as well, by the way, afterwards. Monarchist, unitist, it supports the Crown in Parliament, imperialist, anti-common market, anti-EU, racist. That's all of the English. That's all the kind of English nationalism that we can see. Whereas, of course, even if we went to English republicanism of Ben and Corbyn, for a democratic and social republic, Ben, an English Parliament Ben wanted. Was Ben anti-unionist? I don't really think he was. There's a problem there, but he certainly was in relation to Northern Ireland. Secular, internationalist. He was pro-European, Tony Benn, although he was anti the common market, as we know. But his writings on Europe are not just, they're not sort of Brexity in that sense. Anti-racist, pro-trade union. So what I'm really saying is that whereas in Scotland, and this is where I would get, and I'll come on to this point and then I'll finish back with the Labour Party. So whereas, this is the thing we've got here now. So whereas in Scotland, Ireland and Wales, unionism is opposed to nationalism and republicanism. Nationalism and republicanism go together in Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And the rise of nationalism in Ireland, Scotland and Wales is the door opening on republicanism. Because if Scotland becomes independent, the question, does it need to be a republic or a monarchy, becomes a national question of great significance to those people. You know, they're going towards republicanism, as Ireland have shown. So in that sense, in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, nationalism and republicanism are not the same thing, but they're allies. The SNP is not a Republican Party, as I said before, and yet the left wing of the SNP, I'm absolutely convinced, will become Republican. If it hasn't already, it's becoming that right now as we sit here. Whereas in England, English nationalism is unionist and it's Anglo-British, and it's in that sense reactionary. So English nationalism and English republicanism are opposites. They're enemies. They're opposed to each other. If we want to combat English nationalism, which is dangerous, English republicanism is the weapon that we need to be able to do that. We have got to we've got to address the democratic deficit in England. We've got to address the English question and not give UKIP and Boris Johnson a free pass in promoting English nationalism. Very dangerous English nationalism, which does lead towards fascism, ultimately to authoritarianism and fascism. So as socialists, we don't treat all nationalisms the same. Those nationalisms that are bringing some democracy, we support the democratic aspect. We criticize nationalism everywhere, by the way, but what we do understand is that in the democratic element, there is something progressive. Okay, so in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, there is a democratic element in their nationalism, and that's the bit that we support as socialists. We don't support national chauvinism, national, all those other things. Whereas in England is the dominant nation, the dominant part of the union, and the English nationalism has now arisen, is a part of the degeneration of the Anglo-British state, and we have to pose our Republican alternative to it. And if we don't do that, it's a dangerous situation. It goes back to my original. So if I could end on this last one, coming back to the Labour Party, where I sort of began at the very beginning, just to sort of sum up the trends in the Labour Party, and then I'll finish. You don't know if you remember, this was one that we had a long time ago. I was looking at the Labour Party in one of the earliest, possibly even the first one. I said, here's the big line down the middle of it here somewhere. We can divide the Labour Party into a loyalist and Republican side. The loyalists are the dominant one. The Republicans are quite quiet in the Labour Party. They don't want to upset any, they don't want to rock the boat and upset the party. So it's a broad church of loyalists, monarchists and Republicans. You know, it's got to be ultimately unstable. On the loyalist side, there are some loyalists who have got a social aspect. And I would say Starmer is a loyalist. He's not a Republican at all, Keir Starmer, but he's like a social, I'd call him as a social monarchist. He was in favour, he was in Corbyn's cabinet, he was in favour of restoring the social monarchy, but he wasn't a Republican. And then you've got the liberals like Blair, the neoliberals, if you like. The Blairites, the new Labour people over on the right here, they're loyalists, but they're also free market capitalists. There's Blair, Starmer. On the Republican side of the Labour Party, we have people who are against the monarchy, like Jeremy Corbyn, like Tony Benn, who's now dead, of course, but we're just using him as a reference point. Those people who emphasize the importance of democracy, that's the Benn side of the argument. What we're fighting for is democracy. That's our argument. We're not just anti-monarchists. Corbyn, therefore, and this is how I would finally see that Corbyn, therefore, is what I would call a left social monarchist, and Starmer's a right social monarchist. Left social monarchists are Republican. Corbyn is trying to restore the social monarchy, but he'll say, yeah, in the long term, I don't mind being Republican eventually. You know, he doesn't say he's a monarchist, Corbyn. He's not Sir Jeremy Corbyn, is he? You know, obviously. So they recognise that. They haven't given him a knighthood. Whereas Starmer, they've given him a knight. The Queen's given him a knighthood, so they know that he's completely loyal. So he's a right social monarchist. In other words, that wing that goes towards Blair. So Starmer started in alliance with Corbyn around their 2019 programme to restore the social monarchy. And that's why people were prepared to vote for Starmer, because they thought, oh, he'll carry on with Corbyn. Because they thought, okay, he's a bit more to the right than Corbyn, but he's kind of in the same programmatic space. He wants to bring back, you know, some of the things that Corbyn's talking about, you know. But then, of course, Starmer's gone evolved away even more and more to the right as he's gone, you know, he's come more and more under the influence of the Blairites. So social monarchism is still central to the Labour Party, and that's the argument that we have to do. We have to argue against those people who follow Jeremy Corbyn who say, yes, of course, we need to restore the social monarchy using the Tory state to do that. And then after that, maybe in the long run, we could think about a republic, because it's not that important and there's more important things to do, etc., etc. So we are over here, Ben, and as I said before, as Republican socialists, we can take our sources of Tony Benn and Karl Marx, all part of our broader church of ideas, but we have to take on the democratic arguments against those people who just want to say that we're anti-monarchists, we don't want a monarchy, and not fully understand why this is all about democracy. And I've got back to where I began. So I think that's the point when I stop, and I'm going to stop with this one. Oh no, got that one. Don't go that one. Oh yes, I suppose that's what I've just said, actually. Sorry, there was another one. I didn't realize I had another one. Think about that. And then there's the last one. Labour Party is a monarch. I've just said this really, so it's in there. Labour Party is a monarchist loyalist party. Corbyn Labour was social monarchist. Policies to revive and restore the 1945 social monarchy. Starmer's a right social monarchist. That's what I've done him in orange. You know, he's a bit more loyalist over there. Corbyn's a left social monarchist. He wants to restore the social monarchy. Yes, he's in favour of a republic, but not for now. That's why it's difficult when you start to argue against the Corbynistas. They're going to tell you they are Republican. What are you going on about? You know, of course we'd like to see get rid of the Queen, you know, but not now, just eventually. For Starmer, Republic, never. No, never. We never, you know, he's Sir Keir, not for any other reason. So I think the This will be my final one now. And I come up to this point. There we go. The end, but not quite goodbye. And I'll finish on that point. Okay, I'm going to stop. Yes, I'm going to stop the screen share. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. Okay. I'll mute myself. Over to you, Carol.
Must unmute myself as well. Wow, that was so interesting. A really, really good presentation of where we were and where we are now. Absolutely fantastic. Right, so we're looking for hands up for questions. And Jennifer is the first one to dive in there. Jennifer, over to you. Have to unmute, Jenny. Have to unmute, Jennifer.
Steve, in the light of all you've said this evening, what do you think is going to happen when the Queen dies?
Okay, let me think about that. Okay, I won't answer that straight away. I can't take another question. I don't really know the answer to that. Who knows? We never know. I will think about it and come back.
I think it's going to shake everything up again, isn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, the thing about it, okay, I'll say this thing. If you think of the key symbolic parts of the social monarchy, the BBC, the NHS, and the crown, the monarch, the royal family, even at the head of the whole thing, they're all in their own kinds of crisis for all different reasons, because they've all been subject to privatizations, cuts, and all those other things. You know, they're all wobbly institutions, and yet they were solid. So the royal family is undergoing its own crisis, obviously with Meghan and Harry, and then we've got Prince Andrew and all that stuff. They're also undergoing some sort of shake-up crisis, and what's going to happen when the Queen dies type moment. So I think that, maybe say this point, what we've got to do is not rely upon that. The Republican organization, the official Republican organization of this country, keeps going on about when the Queen dies, we'll get Charles, and then that'll be our chance. But I think that's completely wrong. It's not about those individuals. We've got to say what we want is democracy, and we want it now. You know, we're not waiting for anybody to die. Our program is for now. So what happens when she dies? We don't know whether Charles might become, everybody thinks, well, Charles will be a bad king. Well, maybe he will, maybe he won't. They'll butter him up and publicize him, and who knows. Anyway, I'll stop at that point. So I don't know really.
I was thinking about the effect on the British, well, the English population as an electorate, which I think will be seismic. But
yeah, I think it will.
Yeah, George is the next one with his hand up.
Right. First of all, I mean, you've created a number of items of scenarios, but the reality is there is a distinct possibility, not possibly in my lifetime, but possibly very shortly after, where Ireland could be reunited. I think that's a dimension as Republicans that we've got to look at and face. The other thing is probably Scotland will be the first, well, she is now bidding for a referendum. And I think I cannot see a referendum in the very near future. I think it'll be in the long future, there will be a Scots referendum. But even if Scotland became independent in inverted commas, it'll probably still have the monarchy intact. It'll be a dominion. of some sort, rather like Canada. And possibly you could say the same for Wales. Although Wales is slightly, I mean, the monarchy is very entrenched in Wales through the second senior person of the monarchy, which is the Prince of Wales, which is currently Prince Charles. And that's the other aspect about the whole of this is that the movement will have to come from below. I think the movement will have to play a very large part in the future, rather than say putting another bill in Parliament. I don't think that at the moment is currently feasible, given the you know, the shape of politics in the current Parliament. So I think at the moment we've got to push for some kind of Republican movement from below, but still linking up with the trade unions and elements of the Labour Party. Thank you.
All right, thanks, George. Mari was next. Mari?
Yeah, hello. Well done the presentation, Steve. It's quite complicated, so I will study it again. But it seems to me that what we have analyzed here is the rise of English nationalism, which is reactionary, which tends through Farage and such people tends towards fascism. And what was analyzed previously, that what we saw in Parliament was something of a type of Trump tendency towards that sort of thing. So I think there are signs that things are moving, and are moving very fast. And at the same time, I appreciated the analysis of the nationalism of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, which is different. And myself, having studied Latin America and the nationalism there is, in nationalism, there is an aspect of wanting to be rid of being bossed around by or dominated by another power, like national integrity and like the continuation of progress, human progress. And I think this is very productive, because these will be allies. These will be allies for us. We will have to look for support, because obviously there is not in English, the part of the English which supports the Labour Party is a dwindling minority. And so therefore we have to do quality work, not just big movement. I would be interested to see how we are going to bring all this into a leaflet or some sort of orientation to the party, to the Labour Party, because people know all this, but they are not putting it together. And so it seems to me that we need to find in what has just been revealed in this degeneration, this event of Patterson in Parliament, to find the ideas to give confidence to people and to show the need for, if we keep voting for people and these people are dominated by finance capital, which is in fact taking over, then what's the point in voting? So yes, one continues to vote, but one has to find ways to express a solidarity between ourselves to make to energize people to actually make assemblies. I think the question of assemblies and tribunals, we should come back to this. This thing should be tried. What's happened, and the Assange thing should be tried in public, not just through some sort of organization. Finally, yes, I'm short of ideas of what should go in a leaflet. But it seems to me that we need perhaps to bring what is the structure of the Commons, and what is it that needs doing there, and what about the House of Lords? I think that perhaps we should talk about it more and challenge the House of Lords. I see that there is a certain discussion about it. Yeah. That's it. Thank you. Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
I'm terribly sorry. Yes, I muted myself. Yeah, thanks very much, Marie. It's Larry next. Larry, over to you.
Yep. Oh, right, I'm not muted. Yes, thanks very much, Steve. There's a lot of points there to give serious consideration to, and it's, as I concur with Marie and the presentation. Thank you very much. The point I would like to raise is the Johnson and Corbyn 2019 election and the One Nation argument, which, you know, had massive media support and destroyed Corbyn in that sense. But what I want to try and concentrate on is, following on from that, is the disillusionment of the view of Labour. I mean, basically, Labour's out of touch in relation to any aspect of decline of democracy in view of the youth. And what I want to try and draw to the argument is the leading to the environmental dissent on the streets. This is the element that I'm concentrating on at the moment. I can see, because they don't have any, the state doesn't have any answers to this other than to try and push through the BBC and the COP26, is that there is going to be an element of self-determination for the resolving of the issues, i.e. you can put more grass on your roof, and the BBC tonight was talking about having beehives on your house so that it resolves the environmental issues, which is such a lot of nonsense. But what the argument is that they're trying to push it back onto the people, as opposed to the state taking responsibility. But what I want to try and do is the English nationalism versus English republicanism, and using the youth argument and the environment is the route to the environmental situation is democracy, true democracy within our society.
Yes.
And some of the things that I'm seeing, and this is where I think that the youth are not ready for taking on the state, is that I saw a clip, I can't remember where it was, probably on Facebook, whereby the police were able to kettle the young communists as part of a political group within the environmental campaign. And what they allowed, what the general mass of the demonstration allowed, was for that kettling to take place. I.e. the police were using their political action by segregating one section away from the main body, but the main body allowed that to happen. They didn't
stop it,
protest, and you know, they should have stopped the march and said, look, these people are part of us, they should be part and parcel of the mass demonstration. But that didn't happen. So that in my opinion is an indicator that the youth or the environmentalists have not become politically motivated to bring about true democracy. their concentration is on the environment,
Yeah.
not the democracy of the
Yeah.
resolution
Yes.
to the environment.
Absolutely, exactly. Yeah.
And yes, I think that's the points I wanted to make. But I appreciated the work that you put into that, Steve, and it clarified and made a lot of light bulbs come up in relation to arguments in democracy.
Mm.
Thanks
Yeah,
very much.
absolutely. Russell, your hand was up next.
Yeah, I wanted to raise a point in your talk, which harks back to something that was involved in some email communication within the group earlier, which is, and it sort of raised it raised something for me when you were presenting it here. You categorized the left social monarchists, exemplified by the Corbynistas, as Republican but social monarchists kind of at the same time, because they do nothing about their Republicanism. And I was thinking, I mean, that is a curious contradiction. And what occurred to me, and hopefully you can speak about this, or sort of expand or clarify. They would, the Republican Corbynistas, in inverted commas, social monarchists, would argue that for them, this is a tactical issue. It's got nothing to do with the principle, because they'll say it's obvious that we are Republicans. It would be absurd to think we are anything but Republicans. But the tactical issue is that we are fighting elections within the parameters, or according to the constraints of the crown state. And if we are going to fight elections within those parameters, the electorate is still currently very much pro-monarchy. And it would be electoral suicide to pitch a campaign which is avowedly Republican. And that is I guess that's a dilemma if you are going to if you are still going to participate in electoral politics. Of course, some people here, some of us, I mean, I kind of include myself with some qualification, are beginning to think that electoral politics, according to the rules of this, according to the rules of the crown game, are becoming more and more futile, because as you've demonstrated in your analysis, you can't win according to those rules. So it's got to be a dilemma for all of us.
Absolutely, Russell. Perhaps Steve, well, yes, Jennifer's clapping you there. Yeah, absolutely. And Celia, it's got a lot of support there, Russell, from the people here. So, Steve, would you like to come back in and answer those questions and summarize for us?
Unmute.
I'm going to say, I'll just start with Russell's first of all, because it's freshest in my mind. Is absolutely the case. I mean, as Republican socialists, we believe that the Republic is the way to get us to socialism. So if we're not on the Republican road, we're not on the road to socialism. We're just asking for more money or improvements and so on. So, you know, we're in favour of, we should be in favour of reforms, but what we actually believe is if we don't change the democracy, if we don't make the system democratic, the working class will never be able to exercise its hegemony and really be able to decide things. So our argument is fundamentally democratic, and thinking that we can somehow find another way around that because the system is against us. I mean, it basically says the Labour Party is useless in one sense, because the Labour Party could either become a Republican Socialist Party, in which case it could become a vehicle for what we're doing, or it remains as it is, in which case it's not a vehicle for what we're doing. So in a certain sense, the Labour Party is a problem, which we should try to overcome that problem. You know, we should try to win the Labour Party to a Republican Socialist perspective. Now, the RSDLP, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, they stood MPs, they had MPs in the Tsarist Duma. They didn't have any illusions about the Tsar. They wanted a republic. But they went into the Duma, they won, they went to election campaigns, they campaigned, they made their case to the Russian workers. They got MPs in the Duma, and they made their case in front of the Russian people. And eventually, of course, that worked its way through, and the Russian working class was ready for a republic when it came to 1917, because it took some years to build that. You don't just stand in one election and now you win everybody to republicanism by standing in one election. It takes you, it's a strategy. It has to go over a number, you know, it would have to go over numbers of years. I mean, how long did Sinn Féin struggle to get its aims? And why is that any party that wants to do that? So there's no shortcut. The social monarchists think they've got a shortcut. We're there quickly by ignoring the Republic. But unfortunately, they haven't got there quickly by doing that. They've ended up in defeat in a way, and they haven't left anything behind them. So yes, I think you should carry on electoral politics, but with a Republican program. That's really what has to be won. And 25% of people in this country are vaguely in some way Republican, and that's a large number of people. And there's no party trying to engage and trying to turn that into a political force. But Republicanism is mass politics. It's not like a fringe. I mean, we might only be 10 of us sitting in a room and think, well, Republicanism is a completely fringe, lunatic idea that nobody's ever going to go along with. But actually, out in the country, there are, you know, a quarter of the population are vaguely Republican, and if they're vaguely Republican, we could make them stronger Republicans, and we could get them to vote for us. And that's if we didn't win any arguments elsewhere. So I don't think the left, what I call left social monarchist idea that says, yeah, we'll have a Republican eventually, but for the moment, let's just do this, is the answer. You know, it isn't the answer. It's not on the road. It's not getting us anywhere. So I think we have to knuckle down and go on the strategic road that we need to get. You know, we need to get to. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a clever tactic that doesn't work. What we want is a strategy that works, not a clever tactic. So it means putting republicanism in your immediate program and addressing it to the people, not putting it into something, say, eventually we'll do that. Going backwards now, to Larry's point, I agree. I think what Johnson did, I mean, in the Johnson versus Corbyn thing, what Johnson did to win the election was he took essentially Corbyn's clothes in many ways, using the Tory idea of one nation and levelling up. And we're going to spend money, I forget how many billions they were going to spend on public services. They basically neutralized Corbyn by taking away all that program. But did people believe them? Would they vote for them? Well, they had the English nationalist argument about Brexit. We're going to liberate the country. We're going to get Brexit done. And they managed to get a lot of working class people to vote for them in the red wall seats on that basis. So they did this clever combination of exploiting English nationalism at the same time as stealing the Corbyn clothes Whereas the Labour Party was left going, we're at 6s and 7s, we don't know what we're doing over Brexit, and so on and so forth. So I think that's why the Tories won that election. They'd normally, as I tried to emphasise, they've been winning these elections for hundreds of years, for at least 100 years anyway, generally speaking. But this time it's a peculiar situation, but they managed to do a clever move. They dumped Thatcher. Johnson dumped Thatcherism because he realised that was already unpopular. You know, they're going to carry on with privatising, don't get me wrong, but they're presenting themselves in a different way, and that's what we've got to look at. But I would say this: that English nationalism is a dangerous game they're playing, and it's going to come unstuck for them. You know, so it's a bit like Cameron, who offered an EU referendum. He thought he'd never have to deliver on it. So that was a great move, wasn't it? And in the end, he had to call the referendum, lost it, and lost his job. And Boris Johnson's going to get down the same road. It's a quick road to nowhere. It's not because opening up the English question, opening up the question of English democracy, and all the things that we want to say. So, that's I think where that's going. Marie made a number of points, but one I think that I agree with. Marie talked about that in America, and national liberation. The thing about republicanism is a liberation idea, very much. It's about liberation through democracy, and it has to come over. So national liberation movements are liberation movements. Now, of course, when they win, they then get incorporated into the system. But while they're mobilizing people for democratic aims, they are progressive. And we would support their progressiveness. But we don't support nationalism because we're internationalists. But what we do support is the democratic aspect of it. And I think you can see in Irish, Scottish and Welsh nationalism a democratic element about how Wales and Scotland and Ireland should be governed. They don't like being governed the way they are being governed. They want to govern themselves in a different way. And it's that aspect of it that we should be supporting. But we should be criticising nationalism. But that's quite different from British nationalism, the nationalism of an existing state like Britain or France or Germany. They are about maintaining the status quo. There's nothing liberationist about German nationalism, British nationalism, French nationalism, or any of the national. They're not liberation movements. They are for the status quo. So we've got to look at nationalism quite carefully, case by case, to see what's going on, I would say. And then I'm going back, I think, to George. And I agree, I think, with what George said. These movements that are taking place in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, all at different levels of development, and they will all push England towards having to do something or other. But what we should be doing in England is not waiting for them. We should be trying to mobilise England to do something. And in alliance with the democratic forces in Ireland, Scotland and Wales. I think Ireland is moving towards a united Ireland because of Brexit, this contradiction between the Good Friday Agreement and Brexit and being in the single market. And that is in itself a product of the Irish struggle that got the Good Friday Agreement in the first place, because that was a compromise with the Irish Republican movement. They sort of gave up the struggle almost and got incorporated into the system. But nevertheless, it was a step forward, and now Northern Ireland is in a bit of a pickle. And I think unionism will lose the support of the farmers who want to export to the EU. So I think it opens up a whole series of contradictions within unionism. So I do see that happening, and that won't leave Scotland and it won't leave Wales. So all these things are connected, by the way. So, but the thing is, we in England have got to do our bit. We've got to do our bit in England. We can't just wait and think, well, perhaps they'll force some change in England. We've got to actually mobilise people in England, where the largest part of the working class actually is, where the biggest working class is. So that's why I think. George mentioned the Benn bill, and I quite agree. The importance of the Benn, the strength of the Benn bill is he put a marker down that we can refer to. We can look at what he did. He actually took it to Parliament, was very serious about it, and it's a good marker. But what he didn't do is he didn't take it to the Labour Party. He didn't take it to the working class. He didn't take it to the Labour movement and win them. That's what he didn't do. He just did it his own thing in Parliament. And that's the weakness. So we have to learn from that and say, if we want to get Ben's kind of republicanism or a version of it, we have to take it to the Labour Party. We have to take it to the trade union movement. We have to win those forces to a Republican and socialist perspective. Ben did a great thing, but he never tried to tackle the Labour Party. He just did his own thing. Maybe that's because he was so isolated at the time. He just thought that was the best way forward. Yeah, I mean, by all means, comrades, come back if I haven't answered your questions fully or correctly, and I'll stop there, I think.
Right. Thanks very much, Steve. I think the big question is, how do we do it? How do we win hearts and minds to republicanism? Through these meetings, I'm now realizing how important it is that we do it. But as you say, it's election suicide to say, let's get rid of the monarchy, because they all think of Queen Elizabeth and they all think, oh, she's all her life, she's served the country, and you get all this nonsense. So how do we make people see how important it is to have a republic, to get rid of the crown?
And I'll let me have a go at that, Carol. Just before, I mean, I don't know how we're doing time wise. Let me just have a go at that one, because that's the big question. I think okay, so we'll finish soon. But look, that's the thing we need to discuss next. But what I would want to emphasize was that because we're emphasizing not the Queen or getting rid of the Queen or being anti-monarchist, it's not all about that. It's about something else. It's about the power of the Crown State and the executive, and the fact that republicanism has to come from below, from the people, from the grassroots, growing it upwards. Now, that means that there's got to be local republicanism. There's got to be local assemblies. There's got to be local campaigning work. All those things that go on in localities up and down the country, that's where republicanism is coming from. It could be a people's campaign in Hastings. It could be a people's campaign in London somewhere. That's what we've got to say, that those things that people do spontaneously should be seen as the beginning of republicanism. Republicanism has to come from below and not allow our opponents to say to us, oh, all you're interested in is getting rid of the Queen, which you'll never do because she's so popular, so you might as well go home and go to sleep. That's what they're saying. And we're saying, no, we're not going to be fooled by that. We don't think it's all about that at all. It's fundamentally about democracy. And when people speak about democracy in the Labour Party, they're talking about Republican democracy. They're talking about the sovereignty of the members and the right of the members to elect and make people accountable and subject to recall. So let's start by trying to make the Labour Party into a republic and have a Republican constitution. Let's have a new Republican Labour Party, if you like. We could start there. There's lots of places we could start all this. And Larry, just to finish on this point, Larry, I hope we'll have a look at this, the Bexley Socialists. I mean, I added to them, well, why haven't they put any democracy in their Bexley Socialist programme, for example? They haven't talked about the people of Bexley forming a local assembly to get control. There are lots of ways in which we can practice republicanism, I do believe. And when people realise that, then I think we'll see there's much more. Citizens' activity is also republicanism in a way. It is about the self-activity of citizens, and there's a lot of that going on. It may not be going on outside Buckingham Palace, but that's not where we think it should be. It's going on all over the place, and that's what we have to sort of try to show that, if you think we just want to get rid of the Queen, you've really misunderstood the whole thing. Not that we want to keep the Queen, by the way, but I mean, just
Right, thank you. Thanks ever so much, Steve. It's been an absolutely amazing presentation and a really good discussion as well, as usual.